Hello, everyone. My name's Edouard Tahmizian. I'm the Vice President and Social Media Manager for Internet Infidels Board of Directors. And today I'm with another Board of Director, Jason Thibodeau, who's a member at large. And to give a brief introduction to this excellent gentleman, Jason Thibodeau's education includes having a PhD in philosophy at the University of California, San Diego in 2006. He also has an MA in philosophy from the University of California, San Diego in 2002, and he has a BA in philosophy from the University of California in Berkeley in 1997. And do you want to add an introduction before we get into our questions?
I guess add that my teaching position, I teach at Cypress College, which is a community college in Orange County, California, which is in Orange County, California. Yeah, that's all.
Awesome. Sounds good. All right. All right, so for our first question, we're going to be talking with our viewers about the Euthyphro dilemma. So I guess give a brief introduction to that and tell us what the problem with the Euthyphro dilemma is.
Okay, so I'll try to be as brief as possible.
Yeah.
The dilemma takes its name from a dialogue that Plato wrote called Euthyphro. The main interlocutor that Socrates engages with is named Euthyphro, and that's why it's got that, the dialogue has that name. And in the dialogue, Euthyphro is trying to give an account of piety or the pious. And he decides after discussion that the pious is what all the gods love. So then at that point, Socrates asks a question, which is one way of stating what's come to be called the Euthyphro dilemma. So the way Socrates asked the question is, do the gods love the pious because it is pious, or is the pious pious because the gods love it? So that's one way of stating the question that gives us the dilemma. There are others, so I'll just put it in a divine command context, because I know you want to talk about divine command theory as well. So in the divine command context, the question is, does God command right actions because they're right? In other words, does he command that we do them because they're right, or are they right because he commands that we do them, because he commands them? So the point in the dialogue, the point that Socrates makes to Euthyphro is, well, the two options in the dilemma are mutually exclusive. So the two options are, and I'll just talk about divine command, I'll leave the pious alone. The two options are God commands right actions because they're right. That's option one. Option two is right actions are right because God commands them. So the point is that the two are mutually exclusive. If you accept the first thing, if you say that God commands right actions because they're right, then you can't accept the second thing. You can't say that they're right because God commands them. And if you say the second thing, if you say that they're right because God commands them, then it can't be that he commands them because they're right. Mm-hmm. So that's basically Socrates' point, I think, as I understand it, in the dialogue. And what's interesting is that in the dialogue, Socrates asks that question, and Euthyphro says, "I'm not sure what you mean." And then Socrates, that's my cat's food bowl, which talk.
That's all good.
In the dialogue, Euthyphro doesn't understand. Socrates explains it, and when Euthyphro finally understands, he says, "Oh, well, the gods command," or he doesn't say command. The gods love the pious because it's pious, right? So he's taking the first option, and Socrates says, "Well, okay, well, if you take that option, you can't have the other thing, and so you haven't really given me an account of the pious." So that's the kind of the upshot of the dialogue. Like, it's just you got one of these options or the other. You can't have both. Subsequent to the dialogue over the centuries, I guess, how to date this. I know that Ralph Cudworth talked about this in the 18th century, and other philosophers have talked about it since then. There are concerns that are raised about the second option, the option that says right are right because God commands them. There are concerns that are raised about that option, a number of kinds of interrelated concerns, and those objections have come to be associated with Euthyphro dilemma. So sometimes they're even called Euthyphro problem, or maybe even just they're part of the Euthyphro dilemma. So in fact, I think when most people talk about the Euthyphro dilemma, they're talking about problems that arise for that second option. So I don't know. Do you want me to get into that or into what those problems are?
We can kind of get into. You argued in one of your videos that William Lane Craig, and as well as many other theists, like to make a third option for the Euthyphro dilemma, which is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that like God's nature is itself good, so a good-natured person's obviously going to influence someone to only command good things. So that's the way they kind of get around it, with that third option, to like get out of the whole deal where it's like, because like with divine command theory, you can argue that, if God commanded people to just torture people just for fun, or to do things that were clearly, what we would regard as a society as immoral, if God told us to do them, they would be considered good, by divine command theory. That wouldn't sound right. So what they try to do is say, well, we'll have like an a priori assumption of a good-natured God, and therefore everything he does will be good by definition since he's good-natured. So whatever he commands is going to be good. But and I don't know if you brought this up in your video, but there's a problem with that because it doesn't really get into the nature of good. Like, what do you mean by a good nature? Because if you just say, well, by a good nature, I just mean like whatever God does, and it's circular. It's like good is whatever God does, and God is whatever good does. So you're not really defining the term good. That's like the problem with it. And like, it just leads to just circular reasoning. And you could just go on to that and just say, like, suppose he, because, like a lot of, I guess I'll get into this before you begin your introduction. A lot of Christians and even some Muslims, they'll argue for a form of, divine command theory, which says, and I was actually reading an article, I don't know if you read it, about a Calvinist who posted a work by two other Calvinists who did a review of all these like great Reformed theologians and the Calvinist tradition and like insights they would give. And they argue that, that classical Calvinists, they tend to argue that, God is not the efficient cause of sin. But then the guy argues that even for the sake of argument, let's suppose that God is the efficient cause of sin. They argue that he would still be good because of divine command theory. Like if God's nature says it is good to cause sin, then it's good for him to do that. And that just seems entirely irrational. But according to divine command theory, it works. So if like that's just, and I've seen like a lot of Christian theists like argue that, like it was crazy. Like one site was just like, the Bible is very clear. The Lord Jesus Christ is the cause of all things including sin. And it was just like, it was just crazy, dude. And I was just like, I can't believe, there's people out there that think that there's like God who can be infinitely holy at that, because that's why hell's eternal, right? Infinitely holy and literally be the cause of sin and still be good. So it's like, then you just have problems like that. So yeah, what do you think about that? Do you think the main problem is like defining the term good or do you think that can lead to circularity?
There's definitely an issue related to accounting for what it means, accounting for God's goodness. So I want to maybe slow down a little bit and define a few things just for the sake of maybe people who aren't familiar with all of these terms. But so divine command theory can mean different things, and because there are different versions of it. But the basic idea is that our moral obligations are grounded in divine in the following way. What it is for something to be morally obligatory is for it to be required by God's commands. What it is for something to be morally wrong is for it to be an action that is contrary to divine commands. When it comes to talking about good, we can go down holes that are not fruitful if we don't kind of acknowledge the distinction between rightness and goodness. In fact, there are really good papers about this distinction in the divine command, really good books, in fact, about this that play on this distinction in the divine command kind of literature. But so let me just briefly explain that. So rightness and also obligatoriness and wrongness, they form a cluster of concepts that are called by moral philosophy deontic. Deon comes from the Greek for duty, concern evaluating actions as things we should do or should refrain from doing. Whereas goodness, goodness, badness. Those are a set of, they're definitely moral concepts, but they're different. They don't primarily involve evaluating actions, but they evaluate states of affairs, or like, so the hurricane destroying the city was a bad thing, or right?
Yeah, it'd be like a metaphysical evil, not a moral evil. Yeah.
Yeah. So that distinction is relevant, so good, and the word that we use for these other kinds of properties is axiological. So there's deontic and then axiological. So one way that's relevant is that some divine command theorists, so notably Robert Adams, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's kind of a big name in defending divine command theory. And he makes that distinction, and he says that he does offer a divine command theory about deontic properties, but not axiological properties.
Okay.
So it's worth paying attention to that. People don't always pay attention to that, and this leads to another point I was making. There's all kinds of stuff that's crazy on the internet. And there are definitely Christians who argue for positions that are irrational and very strange. Like that even if God is the cause of sin, he's still good, right?
I know.
It's a very strange thing to say.
I know, I know. Well, I mean, that is a form of divine command theory. It's like especially this peculiar in Islam, because in Islam it's a fact that the Quran specifically states, it specifically implies that Allah is the cause, like he determines all things and he is the efficient cause of everything, including sin. Even like someone like Hamza Yusuf said, he's the direct cause of everything in the universe. And of course, if you were to go up to them and be like, well, then if he's causing people to sin, if he's not just the ultimate or final cause, but the proximate and remote cause of sin, like how is he good? That's what you're going to get, that form of divine command theory. Well, whatever God commands is good. Yeah. If God's nature says it is good to cause sin, then it is good, and of course that just doesn't sit right with us,
There are Christians who've held similar positions. I'm not an expert on medieval philosophy, so I'm based on what other people have said, but apparently William of Ockham held something like that position.
Yeah, I read about,
And so sometimes that extreme view is called voluntarism, though sometimes voluntarism is used in a more narrow sense to just talk about any view that grounds obligation in God's will. But Occam's view is basically whatever God is like is good, and whatever he commands is right. So even if he is someone who preordains that comes in the world and that people suffer for eternity in hell, he's still good because he's God, and that's just it, right?
Yeah, that's like circular reasoning. Like whatever good is God and whatever God is good, because like the way to get around this and defeat those kinds of arguments is you have to define good. And if you just, because it's like saying God is XYZ. Like, what the heck does that mean? What do you mean? Because terms only mean something if you make associations. And if they say, well, how do you define good? If you ask that to that version, if you pose that problem to that version of divine command theory, they're just going to say, well, good is whatever God's nature tells him is good. Then it's like, okay, fine, but like, what do you mean by good? And it's just like, well, whatever God's nature tells him is good. Like, it's like circular. Like, it's like presupposing that good, like moral values aren't intrinsically right or wrong in and of themselves. Because like with something like, let's just say like murder, like you would have to say like murder itself isn't right or wrong. It just depends upon whether God commands us to do it. See, so it's like, then what you're really saying is that there's no objective moral values. It's subjective. It just depends upon like, it's like whether God likes pizza or tacos, it's like that. Like, I seem to think like you'd have to define good as kind of like some atheists like Richard Carrier defined it as. And I was talking to you about before we began this video, like it has to do with what's best for societies, doing actions that are best for societies, vital human happiness and well-being. Like that's why we go around saying like, murder and, racism and all those things are wrong, because they're vitally detrimental to people and they're just unnecessary evils. They're not like for a better cause. They don't help individuals out. Like that's like why we have laws and police officers to help every day, like not be like the purge. So anything that's like better for society, to like get along with each other and people respecting each other, fulfilling our obligations for, like it's kind of like, survival of the fittest and all that, and, doing the best we can with our purpose. That's what, being morally good is all about. And when you define that, then, like pursuant to that standard, does God make rules that fit within that definition of good or not? Because if you don't say that, good and evil are things in and of themselves, and you just keep on saying like good is whatever God commands, it's like, it's just like, well, do you mean like whatever, including torturing a child? They're like, yeah. See, and then it's just like there really is no distinction between good or evil. It's like it all just depends upon like whatever God's nature feels like saying. You know what I'm saying?
I think what you're getting at is what sometimes referred to as the arbitrariness problem for divine command theory, and sometimes people even just call it the Euthyphro problem. It's this problem of arbitrariness, and the idea is that, well, if it's right or what's good is whatever, if what's right is whatever God commands and what's good is whatever in God's nature, then no matter how he is, no matter what he commands,
we just
that's
have to accept
be right.
It, and that's just that doesn't seem right.
And so one way to think about, so I was going to say earlier, there are unsophisticated ways of talking about divine command theory, and also the Euthyphro problem. It's all over the internet. It's all over everywhere. It's hard to avoid. But then there are more sophisticated ways. Among the more sophisticated, and I count Robert Adams, and I would even count William Lane Craig among the more sophisticated responses. Among those more sophisticated responses, there's this effort to avoid that problem, that arbitrariness problem, right? Yeah. So maybe we can get, why I think that they don't work, despite the fact that they're sophisticated. I still don't think it works.
Yeah.
So one thing to say is, and this is a very old, I don't know, very old in philosophy, is hundreds of years old, so it's not very old, but it's 40 some years old. This response, which is, well, so you're worried that God might command that we torture children, right? So, and you say, Ed says, well, says to the divine command theorist, well, so what you're saying is whatever God goes. So what if he commands that we torture children, right? And so the response that goes back to the 70s by Edward Waringa is, well, God is all loving. And notice that he says, not that God is good, but God is all loving, right? And necessarily so. And that matters, that he's necessarily loving. That just means that he's loving in all possible worlds, right? He can't but be loving. And so, and all it seems that it would be, I even contrary to suppose that an all-loving God commands that we torture children, right?
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure that there's a contradiction there.
Yeah, but see, then it all comes back to like, now you have to define love, like how much do you have to do to help out someone to be loving, so even then it kind of can relate to, defining terms, because that's like the most important thing. Like, it's not just is the person good or loving, but what do you mean by those terms, Someone could have a sick, diluted sense of love and, and good, especially like those crazy divine command theories. They have a sick, twisted sense of good. It's like,
right.
If he's positively willing evil like the devil, it's like, how is he causing people to sin like the devil? Then he's evil. That's it.
Well, there's and one question was whether you can really account for what love is without accounting for what it's, because one natural way to talk about love is that when you love a person, their well-being matters to you, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Using an evaluative term, right? Well-being isn't just, maybe you can completely non-account of well-being, that it's just positive mental states or something like that. I'm not sure that you can. So, but anyway, there's an issue there. So, but to go back to the issue, or to go back to the response theorists offer they say, well, since God is all loving, he can't, or at least, or maybe it's impossible that he commands child torture or any of these other things. Now, the question is that a response to the worry, right? Okay, so the worry is something like, well, if what's right is whatever God commands, and what's good is whatever is in God's nature, it's just totally arbitrary, anything goes. And the response is, well, since God is all loving, he can't, it's not like anything goes, he can't command torture, right? Mm-hmm. And his nature is essentially loving. That's not bad, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so so I have a worry. I'm sure that solves the problem, because I think that you have to specify. I want to say more about what the problem is supposed to be. So, mm-hmm. there are different ways of talking about the problem. Maybe they're just different problems. But one thing to say is just that if, and I'm going to just focus on the deontic categories, if what's right is whatever God commands, then if God is different, if God can change his nature, or if God could be otherwise in other possible worlds, that's what I mean. If God could be otherwise, then God could issue other commands. So that's just a problem about contingency. So if God, maybe in this world, he doesn't command child torture, but if he could be otherwise, then there's some possible world where he does command child. And here's the problem. That would mean that it isn't necessarily true that child torture is wrong, but it seems to me that no, child torture is wrong, not contingently, but necessarily.
Yeah, you're right.
So if God could be other in a different possible world, then you have a contingency, just a bare contingency problem. Closely related to that is just sort of specific counterintuitive possibilities. God could command child torture. That's weird. That would mean that child torture is obligatory. God could command that we cheat on our taxes. God could command that we vote for Donald Trump, right? All kinds of things. And that would be weird. That's obligatory to vote for Donald Trump. So those are stories. Now you say, well, nature is essential. That is, he has the same nature in all possible worlds. Then it turns out, well, he can't change. He can't be other than he is. So if he commands, if he doesn't command child torture in this world, then he doesn't in any other world either. That is, if his nature is such that he won't do that here in this world, he won't do that anywhere else in any other world. Yeah. So that seems to solve the problem, except that I'm not the right way to understand the problem. So another way of articulating the problem concerns reasons. So this comes back to the issue of arbitrariness, because I think arbitrariness is ultimately an issue about reasons. So the worry is this: if obligatoriness is just divine commandedness, then right, God's not commanding because he's not commanding that we not torture because torture is wrong. He's not commanding that we not lie because lying is wrong. So why is he doing it? Reason. And it looks like, well, maybe he doesn't have a reason, right? It's just
part of his name. Yeah, that's what I said. It's just circular. It's just like, well, just whatever God commands is good.
And importantly, here's the important point. Even if it is a part of his, a lot of divine command, including William Lane Craig, say this, well, they flow from his nature, his commands flow from his nature, but that doesn't solve the arbitrariness problem. And here's a perfect example of why. Suppose you have a hiring manager who engages in arbitrary discrimination in their hiring. And so they refuse to hire women, or they refuse to hire people of a particular ethnicity or religion or something like that. Well, that is like a paradigmatic example of arbitrary discrimination. It's arbitrary. Now, suppose the hiring manager says, but it's in my nature to despise women. It's just who I am, right? That doesn't mean it's not arbitrary, right? It's still arbitrary to refuse to hire someone of her gender. And so despite the fact that it's in your nature. So I guess what I'm pointing out is whether or not kind of responses, one of which I attributed to Edward Wieringa, whether those work depends on what we think the problem is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think the problem is just that God might command other things in other possible worlds. The problem is, does he have reasons? Or one part of the problem, I think there is more to it than that, but one part of the problem is, does God have reasons for his commands, right? And that's arbitrariness.
Yeah.
Sometimes people just confuse it. I've come across places where William Lane Craig, for example, says, so if it's up to God, then it seems arbitrary. Well, so what it seems like is that God command that we torture babies. Well, that's not arbitrariness. That's a problem. That's a contention about things being other than they are, or being a counterintuitive implication. Arbitrariness has reasons. The concern is that God doesn't have reasons for his commands. Even if we his commands, if they're not grounded in reasons, there's still a problem there.
Yeah. And and how I argued in my paper, I argued a very interesting point, because a lot of people will say, well, to solve the problem of evil, you just have to utilize, the libertarian free will defense, a la, Alvin Plantinga, C.S. Lewis, and others. And that doesn't work. Firstly, because I think there's good evidence out there, especially, via Sam Harrison and his neuroscience, that people don't actually have libertarian free will. They have what we would call, we could even call it deterministic free will. Like, you're free in the sense that you have the natural or physical ability to do otherwise, but that your strongest desire actually acts as the efficient cause of your action, not just the final cause. But it's still a free choice, because though you had to give into it, you did so willingly. Like, you do it necessarily, but willingly. And even Jonathan Edwards, the famous Christian Calvinist scholar, who is undoubtedly even more revolutionary and prominent than John Calvin himself, argued the same thing, that men and beasts and angels and even God can only give into his greatest desire what he has the most motivation to do. And I'll get into that to a minute, because I actually think that's the truth. But it's like, even going on libertarian free will, that doesn't explain anything, because like Adam and Eve in the garden, okay, they had libertarian free will, they could have sinned, but they didn't have to sin. Well, in order to sin, you have to be inclined to sin, especially via a sinful inclination. Now, a Christian may come in and say, they'll use this one, they'll say, no, Adam didn't have a motivation to disobedience. He just had a motivation to take of the tree, because secret knowledge in and of itself isn't bad to partake of. And God put a prohibition on something that wasn't itself wrong. It's like God putting a prohibition on Adam playing golf. Like golf, it's like more like secret knowledge. It's like golf. It's like, it's metaphysically good. It's like morally neutral. It's like it's good in the sense like getting a massage is good, but it's like, he just had that inclination to eat of the tree, and he just abused his freedom because he used his natural ability to take of that tree. So that negates God creating him with an ingrained disposition to sin. But that doesn't work, because for a moral agent to sin, to do something wrong, they need more than just a morally neutral desire. They specifically need a desire to sin. It's to do that itself. For the example, we'll just argue, someone really holy, let's just say Jesus. Hypothetically speaking, let's say he existed. Jesus had, according to the Bible, morally neutral temptations. He experienced, if he would have been there in the garden as a morally perfect being, he still would have experienced temptation to eat of the tree, because he would have been like, oh yeah, secret knowledge, that sounds good. And he has an inclination and still can't sin. And obviously he has the physical freedom to take of it. So, see, that doesn't explain, if he just had that moral neutral motivation, the physical freedom, the theist is saying that's all you need to sin, but he has that, and why can't he sin? Because the answer is, he doesn't have a disposition to sin. It's not the same thing to have a morally neutral motivation as it is to have a disposition to sin. And to kind of make this sound a little easier, this is what will happen from a morally perfect being's standpoint. They'll say, oh, I'm motivated to secret knowledge. Oh, but this also involves stealing. But since I have no sinful inclination, stealing's so terrible to me that it's not in me to do anything evil. And it's like, well, it sucks for me to get past, not eating of the tree, because I have to give up secret knowledge, but they'll have to do it. They'll have to go past that desire, which proves that morally neutral desire isn't itself the motivation to sin. The motivation to sin is its own motivation. You need a sinful inclination to sin. Likewise, you need a holy disposition to do something holy. So this all means something, because, okay, so something sinful is happening in them. Have an evil inclination. So, and how did it get there if everything was originally created very good and You didn't have any problems before the fall. Well, I can kind of go into a long argument to make a long argument short. The answer is when someone experiences temptation to sin, it's not their fault, and you can't say it's the secondary cause's fault because, like, for example, say like if Adam would have been morally perfect, he wouldn't have had an inclination to sin. So you can't say, oh, it's the tree's fault or the devil's fault he had the inclination to sin. Because it's like if the devil tempted Adam as a morally perfect being, he's not going to have that inclination to sin. The moral neutral one he will, but he won't have the evil inclination. He'll just have a righteous inclination. So the answer is God created him with a disposition to sin. So now, like, beyond any and all doubt, what explains how Adam and Eve were able to sin is not just free will. The explanation is that God created them as morally imperfect beings with an ingrained disposition to sin. Well, he created them with the disposition righteous, but the disposition to sin too, and that's a problem. And even like a lot of rabbinical Jews argue that, like, they'll say God created Adam with what's known as the Yetzer Ra. Ra can mean metaphysical or moral evil, depending on the context, but he created him with the Yetzer Ra, which is the moral evil inclination, and the Yetzer Hataf, morally righteous inclination. So that that shows that, and even the famous Calvinist theologian R.C. Sproul, who was a really prominent Calvinist, argued, this paints a terrible picture on, like, the free will defense, because you have God creating a man with an evil disposition and then punishing him, deeming him fit to be punished in hell for eternity for getting into the evil disposition and morally neutral disposition he put in him, that God put in Adam and Eve. And then you have a problem of, can an infinitely holy being, or any kind of holy being, even incline a man to sin? It's like that's because, like, that just shows that the free will defense, like, doesn't explain anything. And it's like now you have to argue, can God cause people to sin? And even if he can't do that, can he even cause people to be inclined to sin? And it would seem that the answer to both would be no, because it's like, especially if this guy's allegedly an infinitely holy being, now you have a problem. So even if there's libertarian free will, it doesn't solve the problem of evil. And then so that's that. And then to get into the last point I wanted to bring up, going on the fact of the evidence, I don't even think there is a such thing as libertarian free will, because to give a short illustration, this is something I thought of, and then the prominent Edwardian scholar John Gershner also brought up an example, because he's like, here's proof that you couldn't have willed otherwise. Like, suppose you're given a circumstance, like, to go to a concert or not go to a concert, and then, like, or actually I'll make a better version of it. You're told by the compatibilist that you can only give in to your greatest desire. So, like, you're like, you know what, I'm going to do the best I can to disprove compatibilism. I'm going to give in to desire that isn't my greatest desire. So let's just say you're in a situation, you're like, okay, what's the best thing for me to do? Okay, so you're like, the best thing for me to do right now is to not hit myself with a hammer. So then you think to yourself, I'm going to disprove determinism and do something that I'm not the most motivated to do. I'm going to hit myself with a hammer. And then you hit yourself with a hammer, and that actually ends up proving determinism. You know why? Because in that moment, you thought that it gave you the most motivation to disprove determinism because of how terrible it would be to live with a God, who's the efficient cause of sin, and blah, 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 blah. And then after computing that data, it now became you now experience more motivation to hit yourself with the hammer. So you ended up giving into this became your greatest desire after, computing the evidence. So it's like when you hit your hammer after thinking about, disproving determinism, it was your greatest desire before you hit yourself. So you actually didn't give into your greatest desire. Like, dang it, that's right. It was my greatest desire to hit myself because I have more motivation to hit myself than I don't. Because then if I can disprove determinism, that means there's not a God, who's the efficient cause of sin. And it's like, so you see what I'm saying? And like, this is kind of like a pattern for everything. Like, it's not like every time you end up doing something, you're only going to be able to give into your greatest desire, like all factors considered. And that seems to suggest that, people do actions of necessity. So I would think that would prove, that everything is determined, which would make God not only the efficient cause of evil inclinations, but sin itself. And now you have a problem there. So yeah, what do you think about that whole example of determinism?
I'm not convinced by it. I really kind of consider myself agnostic about the determinism issue, with maybe slight lean towards determinism that would still be consistent with some kind of compatibilism. But I don't really know. I don't know that I have a great objection to to your hammer example, other than that I'm not sure and again, this is just not sure, I don't know that it's really true that all we can ever do is give in to our greatest desire. I certainly have had an experience in which I feel like acting against my greatest desire. Now, whether that's accurate or not, maybe that's I'm lying to myself, right? And really, whatever I'm doing is
just. I mean, sometimes it's hard to know because sometimes it is a tough call. So yeah,
it is. So I don't know about all, but I'm not sure those sort of things. With respect to your argument that even if we have liberty will, God's still the of sin. I think that you're on very strong footing there, and so in terms of so I understand what you are saying in your paper is that in order to sin, you have to represent the that you're doing as sinful. So in other words, so I think this is one to make your point. You can perform an action that is wrong, but that doesn't make it sinful if you didn't know it was wrong.
Yeah, true.
Right. So
true. Yeah.
So it's only sin if you didn't know it, but then you have to represent it as something that's sinful, right? You have to say, I'm doing something that I recognize as wrong, right? Only then does it count as sin. So there's actually a very strong point that I don't think raised in defense of your position, which is that according to the biblical story, the tree that Adam and Eve ate from was the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And importantly, when they ate it, they acquired knowledge which they lacked, and that seems to be moral knowledge. And so therefore, they could not have represented the action as sin because they didn't know that it was, right? They couldn't, and probably they couldn't even believe that it was. So without any kind of moral awareness, it would just be impossible for them to represent an action as morally wrong. And so therefore, it would be impossible that they sinned, right?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Well, the sin, like I said, the sin wasn't to take of the secret knowledge from the tree, because God put a prohibition on an otherwise good thing. It's kind of like when Jesus was tempted and didn't eat bread for 40 days. Obviously, not eating bread. I mean, to eat bread, especially after 40 days, was not a sin, because he's depriving himself of vital nutrients. But he did that because he just wanted to make up the debt, that Adam and Eve, gave us because of their negative sin debt or whatever. But the sin that Adam and Eve did do though was stealing, because God was like, this is my tree, this is my property, don't eat of it. So that actually was a sin, just the stealing part, not the secret knowledge part. But still, it wouldn't matter because, as I said, in order to sin, you have to experience temptation to sin via not a morally neutral motivation, because I explained that doesn't work. You have to experience it via a sinful or an evil inclination. And how they experience an evil inclination is God created them with an evil inclination. So that actually it wouldn't make them the efficient cause of their sin, but it would make them the efficient cause that motivated them to sin. And even then you have a problem, because that's still something that seems to be intrinsically evil. Like, let's just say a devil came and motivated Jason Thibodeau to go kill his neighbor. I mean, hypothetically speaking. Suppose he motivated you to do it, and then you go and kill the neighbor, and then the cops come, and then they question you and the devil, and then it comes to the devil, and the devil says, oh, no, he's just the efficient cause of the crime. I'm just the final cause of the crime, because I just gave him the inclination. I just gave him the inclination to kill the guy. It's like, I know had I not given him the inclination, he never would have done it, but it's like, he still had libertarian freedom. Yeah. Do you think the police officer is going to let the devil off the hook? Of course not. Because it's like, he didn't just he actually inclined you to go kill the guy. Because like the three-year-old theist is thinking like, all God did was give people like the natural freedom to steal. But he actually had to actively incline them. And so if there's activity on his part, that's why there's a problem. And just while I'm at it, to close up, I'll make the distinction between natural and moral freedom, because Calvinists do it all the time. Like the natural freedom to do something just means like the physical ability. Like, like we don't have the physical ability to fly like a bird. We're physically incapable. Now, there's the physical ability, like having the motor skills to do the action. And there's what's known as the moral ability, which is the motivation or the inclination that I just said to use your natural freedom. So it's like, that's just the argument that compatibilists use, because it's like, people will be like, well, there's no free will in compatibilism. You don't have libertarian free will. You couldn't have willed otherwise. And it's like, well, actually, in the natural sense, you could have. It's just that you're just not motivated enough, because it's like there's like to end it off real quick, like people will be like, well, what about God? You know, because allegedly in the Bible, God like can't sin. So they're like, oh, you know, God can't sin. Does that mean there's something wrong with him? Well, no, because he has the physical freedom to do the action like this. He's just not inclined to use it. Or like I like to argue, and Christians like to argue, it's like eating dog waste but worse. You're just so not motivated to eat it. That's why you can't do it. So it's still free will. So it's like that's just the thing. And it's just like, so even inclining someone to sin even seems to be something morally evil too. So then you still have a moral objection.
Yeah, you know what? This is a good point, because God didn't command that Adam and Eve not eat the donkey drops, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And why not? Because they had no inclination to. He didn't
Yeah,
need
or
to.
very little of it. Yeah.
So he told them not to do something that they were inclined to do.
Exactly. He gave them I know, and they'll say, well, that was the whole point, to give them a trial. But it's like, well, if you're giving them a trial, that just shows how much you want them to sin, right? Or inclining them to sin, especially. You know, so that's like the thing too. So it's like, even going off of that, you still have like a moral objection, because especially since he's an infinitely holy being, I would think like the last thing he would do was create him with an inclination to sin. Because if they just had a righteous inclination, a moral neutral inclination, they'd be like, oh yeah, secret knowledge, that's tempting, but it involves stealing, but I'm not motivated to steal, so I'll persevere past the morally neutral motivation. They'll still be unable to sin. So now you have that. And it's like, and I do think there's kind of good evidence of because it's like, even in the Bible, more so in the Quran, but even like in the Old Testament, it seems to me that like there's some verses you can interpret that means like God determines all things, like things happen of necessity. So yeah, so oh well, the Alvin Plantinga screwed either way, so doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was a really good talk. We
Yeah.
had a lot discussed. Did you have any final thoughts, or did you want to tell people how they can reach you and stuff?
Oh, yes. I mean, there's a lot more to say about
Yeah, go
Euthyphro.
ahead. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, we can talk about it now or not. So if you want to know, if you want to find what I've said, so I have a very small YouTube channel with only a few videos called Jason Thibodeau's Philosophy Channel.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I can send that to you. You could put it in this maybe. And then I also have blogged at what used to be the Secular Outpost, but is now, what is, you know, you remember that? I can't remember. So the Secular Outpost is closed, although the posts are all still there, and it moved, and it's got a new name, and I forget the name, and I should know it, but I don't. But you could put a link to that as well. Description. I mean, it's a group blog. Lots of people do it. Lots of blog there, so it's not just me, but there are some posts there. So that's where, if you're interested in learning more about things I've said about youth, I guess one thing that I'll throw out there is there's this other issue that comes when it comes to divine theory, which is just it doesn't seem like that God tells us not to do something is the kind of thing that can make an action wrong. Like, what could make an action wrong? Well, that it causes harm, it causes suffering, it reduces that, it doesn't respect agency or something like that, but that tells me not to do it. How could that make it wrong? Certainly if Ed tells me something, that doesn't make it wrong, right? So in the human realm, people can command things all the time, but those make no difference to what I have reason to do or reason not to do. So why think God's commands have this special capacity that no one else's do? That God, when he tells me what to do, I suddenly have reason to do.
That's exactly right. It's just a guy barking orders.
It's a guy barking orders, exactly. Why should I pay any attention to him? Now, he may say, well, if you don't, I'm going to punish you.
Yeah, but that's not
divine command.
Good answer.
It's not a good answer. Even a human could do that. Hitler could do that, right?
I always thought that, dude. That's a good way of thinking, because it's like, if he's like, well, I'll send you to hell forever, but it's like he could send me to hell forever, saying that if I told him he was evil for being the cause of sin, you know? Yeah. Divine command theory is the truth. You could be like, you better say that I'm good, even if I cause people to sin. Like, not just inclined to sin, but to sin. It's like, no, dude, that's what evil people are going to just be like, no, that's what evil people do. You have a distinction without a difference between God and the devil. Like, what's he going to say then? Like, and he not only would he be permissively willing evil, he'd be positively willing it if he's the cause of sin. So, like, there's no way around that objection. He has to say he wills it in the same way that the devil wills it. which isn't like evil for a greater good, but it's like evil for the sake of itself. So that would mean he's evil. Like there's no way out of it.
Yeah, it's
Even causing people to be inclined to sin. That's just evil for the sake of itself. Like even if people were going to say, well, you need to be inclined to do good and evil because oh yeah, and then there's the argument of like libertarian freedom is the basis of morality. Like even if people in compatibilistic freedom like have a will that's free in the sense that it's free from compulsion, they're still not responsible because they can blame it on their desires, blame it on full causal determination. And there's kind of like a tu quoque argument to that, which Calvinists like to use, Christian Calvinists like to use, because it's like in order to do something, you have to be inclined to do it. And God's the one who causes people to be inclined to sin anyway. So it's like, are you just going to say, oh, I'm not responsible since I gave into that sinful inclination? Because like, had I not had the inclination, I couldn't have sinned. Sinning wouldn't have been feasible for me to do. Like, you're not gonna, who would use that argument? And they're like, of course you're responsible. You willingly did it. So it's the same thing in compatibilism. It's like, of course you're responsible. You willingly did it. And then it's like an issue of how much should one be inclined? Because like people are gonna die and be like, if I would have been raised better, if I wouldn't have been raised by bad parents, I wouldn't turn out to be a bad person. Like, like there's all kinds of things. Like how come God doesn't give equal advantages to all? There's all those kinds of things too. So it's like, the libertarian free will defense just doesn't really work because it's like you're not really free. I mean, you're not free from your birth. You're not free from your nature or nurture. You're not free from the laws of physics. And it's like there are some things that are kind of determined. Like, like when people get their foot stabbed and they take God's name in vain, like almost involuntarily, like they take it in vain out of necessity, and it's like no one's going to say they weren't morally culpable because they had to do it. They're morally culpable, but even though they had to do it, they willingly did it. So, what do you have to say?
What you're saying reminds me of something that you might be familiar with, and that is an argument Galen Strawson about free will.
Mm-hmm.
And he basically says, even if we have libertarian free will, it doesn't matter in terms of our ultimate responsibility. Why? Well, because I do what I do because of the way that I am, right? Yeah. And I think that's what I do what I do because of my faith. I didn't choose to be the way that I am. At an ultimate level, I didn't choose to be the way that I am. I was born with inclinations, and to some extent they developed through my upbringing, over which I had very little control, if any.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah. And so I do what I do because of the way that I am, but I'm not responsible for the way that I am, and so I can't be ultimately responsible for what I do, right? Yeah. But who can be ultimately responsible for what I do? God.
Yeah, exactly, because he's the one who gave inclinations. Yeah, like I'm of the position where it's like, I guess I would say I'm leaning on full determinism, but if I were to play it safe, I'd be like on a hybrid system. Like some actions we do are determined, some aren't. Like, like when like Keith Augustine uses it too, like when you're looking the other way in your car and you turn around and you see a car and you just put your foot on the brake, almost like an involuntary reaction, but you willingly do it though. That's an action that happened of necessity. Like you just, did it, you had to do, but you willingly did it. So it's like, so there's some actions where you have to do them, and like some actions that it seems like you didn't have to give into your greatest desire. So I'm maybe on at like worst the hybrid system of some libertarian choices, some determined. And if I were to be a little more risque, I would say all things are determined. But either way, I believe in both scenarios, people are morally culpable because they willingly act on their desires. So they're still responsible. But it's like, like we were discussing, even with libertarian free will, you have your inclinations, your upbringing, and those things are determined. So it's like, it's like semi-determinism still, so.
It is. And then there's a question of, well, if we're not, so Galen Strawson says we're not ultimately responsible for what we do, but that doesn't mean we're not responsible at all.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Ultimate responsibility may be different than responsibility, right? Yeah, so there may be some sense of responsibility, and I think that's probably right. But then working out exactly what's required for a person to be responsible and the extent of their responsibility, those are questions. But I think we can agree that given Strawson's insight, it would be evil in an outrageous degree to send someone to eternal torment because they sinned, right? Because they can't, in some ways, they're I mean, it's not that they can't help themselves, it's that they're just not responsible.
Yeah.
They are the way that they are, and they're not fully responsible for that. So to punish them for eternity is just evil.
Yeah. I would argue like you're responsible, but yeah, not for an eternity, because it's like that's definitely the truth, that even inclining someone to sin would negate from especially infinite holiness. So if God's clearly not infinitely holy, so then the answer would be he's finitely holy, because he's not infinite, he's finite. And if he's finite, a finite crime against a finite being is finite amount of punishment.
Exactly. It's so bizarre that I mean, and not all Christians believe in infinite torment, but so I'm specifically talking about the ones to be a very bizarre thing. They focus on this idea of justice, like, so their idea is that crimes or wrongdoings need to be they need to be accounted for, that something has to happen, people have to pay a penalty. Wrong, even if you think that that's right, still eternal torment, that doesn't seem. And if you're the creator of these sinners, what would you're eternal, perfect, holy, loving creator of these sinners who cannot be harmed because you're because you're perfect, what would you do? Presumably you would love them so much that, while you would want them to acknowledge their wrongdoing, you would want them to somehow be rehabilitated, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so you would do what you could to rehabilitate them. And since you're all powerful, presumably you can bring about their rehabilitation.
Yeah, if you make people imperfect, expect imperfections,
Yeah.
And Jonathan Edwards, if I asked that to like a knowledgeable Calvinist like Jonathan Edwards, he would say, well, God has a right to make them imperfectly, because since they're inferior beings, all they deserve is inferior perks. And one of those things includes having a disposition to sin they have to like combat and stuff. And like, it's still fair to send them to hell, because see, his whole point was, and he even acknowledged that Adam had the disposition to sin in his 265 footnote. You read it, that I quoted on my paper. But he said he thought that the evil inclination came about only because of the devil's tempting. And but I already showed you that isn't the case, because it's not the like, for example, like if I see a woman and I experience sexual attraction, it's like saying, well, it's the woman's body's fault. But really, no, it's the parents giving me a heterosexual nature. It's the nature that inclines. See, it's just the same thing. It's God's giving them the disposition. He was giving them the sinful attraction to what the serpent was saying in the fruit. It's not the serpent's talking and convincing itself, because like I said, if it would have been Christ in the garden, assuming he was God and was perfect, he wouldn't have had a sinful inclination. He would be like, no, devil, it doesn't matter, Satan's too terrible, I'm not motivated to do it. So there you go.
But even if we did blame the devil and said it came from the devil, we still have a problem, don't we? Because the devil's a created being.
Yeah, well, how did the devil get even? Yeah. But yeah, so it's like, being inclined is the creator of your nature's fault. So there's an issue there.
There's no question about that.
Yeah, so it's like, and then to not only that, dude, but then like I said, you have Christians that say even if he's the cause of sin, he'd be infinitely holy, and they'd be deserving of infinite torment. Like, come on, dude, like that's just. But it's like it all goes down to like, what do they mean by holiness? Like, what is the standard? And as we've discussed today, like that extreme form of divine command theory. Because it's like infinite what, See, it's like people get so amazed, like, oh, it's infinitely holy, but it's like infinite what? Like infinite, like dog waste? Infinite? What is the infinite in regards to? And we've seen that, that extreme form of divine command theory just isn't anything. It's just circular. It's like God is whatever good is whatever God is. He can cause sin. Now you distinction the difference between God and the devil, and that doesn't work. So.
Yeah. Yep.
Yep. All righty. Well, that was a very good talk. And then in a couple of minutes, I will, or maybe even like in a minute and a half, it's pretty easy to download this. I'll give you the link to this, and you can share it around.
Cool.
Let me
tell you a couple of links that you can put in the description. That's all.
Sure.
Okay.
All righty. I guess you can give that to me in the email, or
Google. I'll give it to you. Sorry, Google was asking it because I think I might have said
that's funny.
The word. I will email you the links and just real quick right now, and then you can just, if you could, in the description, and that way, if people are interested, they can look at other things.
Okay, I'll add it to the video. Alrighty, sounds good.
All right, thanks, Ed.
Thank you.
See you later.